Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of our fully interactive 2020 digital conference, Improving outcomes from addiction. We already see the clinicians who are looking for CEUs putting their name and email address in the comments. We appreciate that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Liz Means with A Way Out to talk about what to expect today and to introduce what she does at A Way Out and what A Way Out is.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Means, and as Danny mentioned, I am the Executive Director of A Way Out, and I'm honored to be so. A Way Out is a nonprofit in Western Colorado, providing individuals and families in crisis with drugs and alcohol, ongoing clinical and peer support, as well as financial help getting access to treatment and recovery support. We help hundreds every year. It's thousands now at this point, and we are so blessed. We have numerous programs, not only the year of free clinical and peer support, but we have a program for family members, free counseling to help them cope with what's going on in the family. And that's children ages 7 and up, as well as adults. And we also have an alumni program, which teaches people that they can have fun making friends with others in recovery and doing awesome things that we put together. You know, while helping all of these people, what's amazing to me is people with addiction is the resilience to live, to succeed, and to get better. And that's what this conference is all about. There is a way to thrive in recovery, and that's why we do this. So, but this conference would not be possible without the sponsors. And it is these very sponsors who have made it possible for us to put on this conference. These sponsors are treatment programs that we personally work with and refer to that we believe wholeheartedly in providing excellent care. So we're thrilled about that. I also want to mention that the conference is interactive, and we hope that you will ask questions. There will be a break halfway through to ask questions. And for those of you requiring or asking for CEUs, we would like for you to sign in your name in the chat section or comment section, and also ask some questions so that there can be clarification of things for the general public. We'd appreciate if you'd help us out that way. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce one of our board members, John Bruni. He is an esteemed gentleman who has helped guide us along our way over the years, and he will introduce the speaker. John.
Hi, Liz, and thank you. My name is John Bruni, and I am a member of the board of A Way Out. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Rokelle Lerner. Rokelle is a pioneer in the development of cutting-edge treatment for children and adult children of alcoholics, and a renowned author and lecturer in the field of addiction and relationship issues. She has trained counselors, psychologists, teachers, and social workers throughout the world in healing the family from the ravages of addiction. Rokelle is the senior clinical advisors for Crossroads Recovery Center in Antigua. She has received numerous awards for her work, including the National Association for Children of Alcoholics Lifetime Achievement Award. She has appeared on Oprah, Good Morning America in 2020. Rokelle designs and presents training workshops and seminars on addiction, recovery, and relationship issues for both the private and public sector. She is an inspirational keynote speaker that can address difficult topics with expertise, clarity, compassion, and humor. Rokelle is the author of numerous books, way too many to mention at this point in time, but my personal favorite is The Object of My Affection is in My Reflection: How to Manage the Narcissistic People in Your Life. Rokelle's books are available on Amazon.com. And to learn more about Rokelle, visit her website at rokellelerner.com. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Rokelle Lerner.
Hi, everybody.
Well, hello. So we're going to get set up for today, and I just want to let you know you're going to hear Rokelle sort of talking to me. We're working together today to go through the slides. So I'll be here just to kind of help and move the slides along. So Rokelle, take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to talk to you today. And I have my email address on the next slide. If you could change it, Danny. And if you have any questions or you need some clarification on what I'm about to tell you, not quite yet, Danny, go back. If you have any questions, clarification, you can email me. I'm also available for weddings, bar mitzvahs. No, I'm kidding. All right, now you can change the slide, Danny. There you go. And just keep it right there for a minute. Before we start the presentation, I want to say three things. And the first thing I want to say is a big thank you to A Way Out, and particularly Liz Means for inviting me. A Way Out does some wonderful, wonderful projects, and it's a pleasure to be invited by them. I also have to do a shout out to Danny Colella here for helping me navigate the technology. It's a big deal. So thank you. The second thing I want to say is to urge you to please resist diagnosing yourself or others in your life. As I speak about narcissism, this has to be done by a caring, empathic, skilled therapist. And the third thing I'd like to tell you is that I give the best lecture on narcissism you've ever heard in your life. So with that, I will continue. Now, before we start the slide, I want to acknowledge what seems to be the obvious, particularly these days, that we're living in a culture that focuses on self-adoration and enhancement. And this slide shows, I realized one day as I was looking at the magazines that first there was People magazine. And then you can click it, Danny. There was a magazine called Us. And then it went to Self. And recently I got this kind of magazine in the mail that's called, you can click it, it's called Me. And we have really focused on the self, and there was a self-esteem movement, and I'll talk about that a little later. But we also think that coexisting disorders is a new phenomenon. And I just have to say that coexisting disorders have been around for centuries. And you can, like we see in the next slide, when you think about some of the fairy tales we've been read to as children, Goldilocks, Cinderella, Snow White. Now, Goldilocks is antisocial on pot, I believe. She breaks into people's houses, and the first thing she does is start sampling the food. And then she probably develops a sexual addiction. She hops from bed to bed to see which one fits just right. And, I'll go on. Cinderella is on hallucinogens and profoundly depressed. No, actually, Cinderella is bipolar. She tweets with the birds, then gets really depressed. But, like any good codependent, she waits to be rescued. She chooses some guy the prince, who loves her desperately and wants to get her and forgets to get her name and address. Develops some kind of shoe fetish. And, I think probably the most profound story of narcissism is Snow White. And they don't call her Snow White for nothing. She's probably on cocaine. So Snow White's mother is a narcissist. She stands in the mirror and talks to herself most of the day, doesn't she? And what does Snow White do to escape her clinically interesting family? Well, probably one day when she was high, she runs out of the house and she surrounds herself with small asexual little men. Each of these guys have a major flaw, and they're named that way. Dumpy, no, not Dumpy, it's Grumpy, Dopey, Sleazy, or whatever his name is. And she cooks for them and she cleans for them. And then sadly, she waits for some necrophile in the woods, some guy who loves to kiss dead women in the forest. Coexisting disorders have been around forever. And if you learn nothing else from this lecture, just be careful what you read to your kids. terms of fairy tales. The purpose of this lecture, by the way, is not to vilify narcissists. It's to shed light on the destructive relational dynamics, particularly of narcissistic addicts and alcoholics, and suggest some tools that may support their treatment and recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, what we know is that addiction is a narcissistic disease. And unfortunately, this narcissism doesn't diminish rather after treatment or even recovery. In fact, after treatment, narcissistic traits are often exacerbated and is a major cause for relationship disruption and relapse. And before I go into the definition of narcissism, I know that narcissism, that diagnosis, was left out of the DSM-5. And the narcissists were really upset about that, actually, to not be included, regardless of whether it's in the DSM or not. From my experience in doing treatment over the years, and probably for you as well, clinicians need skills in dealing with pervasive narcissism that does exist in drug addicts, those with process addiction, and alcoholics. Typically, in the research on narcissism, we've been too heavy on the grandiosity aspect. And narcissism has typically been associated with what gender? Men. Absolutely. There are narcissists who are rude, abusive, aggressive, but there's also a phenomenon called mirror narcissism. And these are also folks with narcissistic traits. They appear the victim. They can appear to be very helpful, but they're seething. They prefer to attach themselves to some rising star. But when I define narcissism for you, and I'll talk about mirror narcissism a little later, the next slide will show you the definition of narcissism. And narcissism stems from the disconnection of the essential core of self. It's a desperate attempt to solidify the self at any cost. Folks, the narcissist must protect themselves by feelings of grandiosity and omnipotence. And the way they do that is through chronic devaluation of other people. The narcissist and those with strong narcissistic traits have acute radar for the limitations of others, particularly those who offer them help and support, like therapists, like counselors, like spouses. And this investment, if you will, in grandiosity spares the narcissist the terror unconsciously associated with dependency. And it's this pervasive fear of dependency, enshrouded by grandiosity, that is central to the narcissistic personality structure. I know that was a mouthful, but the terror associated with dependency and abandonment is what I invite you to hang on to with this. It's a bit like living in hell. It's the yearning or longing to be of sole importance to another. But this yearning or longing can never be met. Now, remember, what distinguishes narcissistic behavior from pathological narcissism is both intention and intensity. While some people may exhibit narcissistic traits, a pathological narcissist will routinely and intentionally use destructive narcissism and narcissistic tactics to gain false superiority and exploit relationships. Most of the addicts that I work with and alcoholics have strong narcissistic traits. However, I wouldn't call them pathological narcissists. And we'll talk about that as we go on, what the difference is. So the next slide will show you that there are three pathological areas of functioning. And one is that the narcissists have a basic sense of inferiority. Secondly, narcissists have a shifting morality, which is an understatement. Whatever they have to do to get that mirroring of admiration is what they'll do. So they'll shift their morality depending on what they need. Narcissists have numerous shallow relationships, have a lot of difficulty sustaining love, and have an impaired capacity for commitment. However, the irony is you will rarely, if ever, find a narcissist without a relationship. Narcissists need to be in a relationship, and they need that mirroring. So the next slide will show you that there are so many theories. No, back one, Danny, thanks. There are so many theories of the etiology of narcissism, you know, ranging from analytic to psychodynamic to existential. I find that what has been most helpful in the people I've trained, and for me, is a combination of the psychodynamic and the neurobiological. So I want to go through a little bit about the etiology of narcissism. There's a saying, you can't leave the trap till you know you're in it. And I think it's been helpful to me over the years to really see what the basis of this is. So in the next slide, what you'll see is that narcissists grow up in a family where there is either overvaluation or devaluation. So you are overvaluated depending on your usefulness. You will either be praised as, you know, the wonderful child or the wonderful person, or you will be devalued if you don't meet the needs of a narcissistic person or a narcissistic parent. And what I'd like to point out is this: when you are doing therapy with a narcissist, you will either be the best therapist in the world, overvalued, or you will be cut off at the knees when you start causing ripples in the mirror, when you start challenging them. And the next slide, developmentally, from the research, developmentally, the inception of narcissists starts in the rapprochement stage of development, or about 15 to 24 months of age. In this stage of development, with toddlers, basically, there is a growing realization that the excitement of pulling the pans out of the cupboard and putting hands in the toilet, that kind of excitement is not going to be met by the parent. There is a need for the parent to attune properly to the child as they struggle with this excitement. So when there is, and by the way, we know that toddlers have an excess of epinephrine that allows them to explore the world with energy and excitement. So now we have a big clash. That little person's really is excited, it's not met by the parent, and that toddler, so to speak, has gone from a high excitement to a low in a very short time. Let me explain this another way, because it has to do with how the nervous system develops. And Dan, you can change the slide again. Thank you. There's a cycle of attachment and repair. And that, stop the clicking right there, if you would. Go back. If you, yeah, just stop right there. Thank you. Let's say you have a toddler in the grocery store, and that toddler sees a sugar cereal, or the toddler sees a candy bar, and you happen to let that kid run around. That little boy or girl wants to grab that candy bar. There is a need. There's that physical tension within that child, that epinephrine, that they're excited, they want to go grab it. The parent goes in and says, no, you can't have it. And I've seen this so many times in a grocery store, the screaming and yelling at kids. What happens to that child when the parent says no? Well, of course, there's a tantrum. There's rage. Now, in this cycle, relaxation or repair can happen if the caregiver stays close by and holds an interpersonal bridge, holds a loving, firm limit, and yet lets that child know that what they're doing is not okay. This is called the repair stage. But if that repair stage is absent, you can click it again, Danny. If the repair stage is absent, that child gets stuck in physical tension and rage. That child will feel alone, exposed, without the skills to deal with one powerful emotion, and that's called shame. And if this happens time after time, if that child is raised by parents who are not fully functioning adults, practicing addicts, alcoholics who are parents, this scenario sets up the child to experience shame, withdrawal, and rage, and not be able to move into that repair stage. Okay, everybody take a breath out there. Great. I want to show you, if this develops over time, Danny, can you put the next slide on, please? That child is given the message, don't be who you are, be who I want you to be. Who you are disappoints me, angers me, and threatens me. If you can't meet my needs, you are expendable and of no value. Be what I want you to be, and then I will love you. And if you click it again, Danny. And this is exactly the narcissist's core belief that they will project on the therapist, on the clinician, and everybody else. If you meet my needs, then I will love you. The narcissist's core belief. And as we see, part of that being stuck, and in the next slide, we'll talk about the neurobiology of all this. Alan Shore, in his research, and as well as Daniel Siegel, shows that brain imaging studies suggest that the deficits in emotional connection between children and their primary caregivers at this rapprochement stage appear to affect the development of right brain areas involved in empathy and compassion. And as we know, that's one thing that true narcissists are unable to give, is empathy. They don't really feel much remorse and therefore can't feel much compassion. And that the intense state of shame reflects a sudden shift from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. So when a child is raised this way, it affects the autonomic nervous system. And as you see in the next slide, this is a healthy nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is the gas. Parasympathetic is the brakes. When an individual, a human, gets stuck between that physical tension and rage, they can't balance their arousal and they can't relax and settle down. As you see, a healthy nervous system is in that middle ground, that stage where there is balance between arousal and settling. Let me show you what happens in the second slide when there is damage to that autonomic nervous system. That what we've seen with narcissists and children who are raised in this kind of environment, they get stuck on the on switch, which is panic, rage, restlessness, or they get stuck on off, which is the parasympathetic, the brakes. They get stuck in depression, numbness, freezing, sometimes dissociation. They have trouble balancing that autonomic nervous system. So folks, the next time you're dealing with a very difficult addict, alcoholic, or narcissist, somebody with narcissistic traits, remember some of the etiology of this and remember what age group you're dealing with. As you'll see in the next slide, you're dealing with the age of a toddler. You're dealing with that stage. And the fundamental job of a toddler is to rule the world. And the rules of a toddler, as you'll see in this slide, the rules of a toddler is, if I like it, it's mine. If I can take it from you, it's mine. If I had it before, it's mine. Even if you saw it first, it's mine. It can never, ever, ever be yours in any way. Now, sometimes when I'm dealing with somebody who's challenging and difficult, I was dealing with a sex addict alcoholic, and this was in treatment. And this person happened to be pretty aggressive. I had to really remind myself that this is about trauma. And this is really about what happened to them a long, long time ago. And really, I'm dealing with that kind of emotional age of a toddler in many, many ways. So as you'll see in the next slide, this sounds like a lot of other diagnoses. I'm aware of that. So is somebody an antisocial or a cruel narcissist? Is someone a borderline personality or a thin-skinned narcissist? It can even sound like a histrionic. Let me tell you some differences between a narcissist and these other diagnoses. I mentioned histrionic. Histrionic personality can show genuine empathy and remorse, and that's not something you'll see very easily in a narcissist. Antisocial or cruel narcissist, there is a distinction between psychopaths who have no conscience and therefore no need for self-deception, and narcissists who really use self-deception to keep the emotional consequences of shame out of their awareness. There is a difference. I think where these two blend, narcissism and borderline personality, probably has the most overlap. So let me talk about that difference, because when I do this training, a lot of people say this sounds a lot like borderline personality, and it does. So in this slide, you'll see that there is you got the next slide, Danny? Hello? Thank you. The differences between borderline personality and narcissism. There's a fabulous book written about this, and it's by Dr. Andrew Morrison, called Shame, the Underside of Narcissism. People with a borderline personality are too preoccupied with the danger of fragmentation to deal with shame. And fragmentation, of course, meaning the dread of the loss of sense of self, the breakup of continuity. Morrison says that the experience of shame necessitates a modicum of self-cohesion. And when concerns of fragmentation dominate, patients do not have the luxury of registering shame. For narcissists, shame is their central affective experience. Narcissists can have suicidal ideation, and they can even have some reactive psychosis under severe stress. But, suicide runs against the grain of a narcissist. Self-harm runs against the grain of a narcissist. That addict who has profound narcissistic traits spends his or her life expunging shame. And they do that through rage, through envy, being a victim, through contempt, righteousness. And we know that shame is such a powerful emotion, isn't it? It can cause us to sever relationships, sink into depression. Shame is what propels most addictions. It underscores compulsive behavior. And in this slide, I'd like to just talk about shame for a minute in this next slide. All emotions are what we call adaptive. somatically, if we can stay with an emotion, if we can register it in the body and breathe and really pay attention to that emotion, it can inform us about something going on internally or externally. It can help us cope with life. For instance, fear. Fear can be about past trauma, or fear can mean that there's danger. Sadness, if you follow the sadness in the body, it can be about grief. It can be about something in your environment. The one exception is shame. Shame is maladaptive. It does not lead to any adaptive action, and we do not want to deepen it. In fact, we want to help people to externalize it. And frankly, traditional talk therapy isn't always the best way to do that. So throughout this, I'm going to show you some exercises maybe you can use to externalize shame. Shame is a wound of what I call not belonging. It's a deep sense of unlovability with the ongoing awareness of how very much one wants to connect with others. Yet the terror of vulnerability keeps the narcissistic addict from connecting in the way they need to. You know, I would say that the root of narcissism, I mean, there's situational narcissism, of course, if you're a movie star or a football player. But I've worked enough with young children and adult children of alcoholics, and I'm an adult child of an alcoholic, to know that the attachment trauma in growing up with a parent who is an addict and alcoholic is pretty profound. There is a writer and a poet named Sam Keen. And Sam Keen says that to the extent we were not held, we will find something to hold on to, some substitute for the holding we did not get. The nature of addiction is all in the way we learn to hold on, to grasp, in order to make up for the holding and the comfort that we did not get. I think that is pretty profound. The one thing that chronically shamed addicts, or addicts with a lot of shame and narcissistic traits, have in common is they lead a profoundly lonely existence. They can do a great performance, but inevitably they can't connect. They just can't connect very well, and yet have a deep yearning to do that. So I'm going to change the focus here, and I want to show you the profound example of a narcissistic relationship. And this is about Ovid's tale. You can change the slide, please. The Ovid's tale of Narcissus and Echo. Again, this exemplifies the anguish of a narcissistic relationship. And, you know, you see Narcissus bending over, trying to find himself. And then you see Echo. Does she look particularly concerned? Don't think so. I think this exemplifies the narcissist and the mirror narcissist in a relationship. Echo was a water nymph, and Echo was punished by Queen Hera for distracting her so King Zeus could play footsie with the other water nymphs. Queen Hera punished Echo by taking away her voice and allowing her only to echo other people. Now, Echo fell in love with Narcissus. We have Narcissus, who is a beautiful young man who was obsessed with water nymphs. Now, today there'd be help for it, but then there wasn't. That was a joke. So Echo fell in love with Narcissus' beauty. Now, what's interesting is the literature doesn't say that Echo fell in love with Narcissus. She fell in love with his beauty. And Narcissus paid no attention to Echo's wailing and mournful cries. Now, to the gods, unrequited love was a sin. So we all know how Narcissus was punished. The gods punished Narcissus by causing him to fall in love with his own reflection. Ladies and gentlemen, narcissists are not in love with themselves. They are in love, so to speak, with their reflection. Contrary to common belief, narcissists aren't selfish. The truth is they don't have much of a self. Their core is a bit paralyzed. And to a narcissist, you'll see that in the next slide, Danny, you have to pay attention, darling, that the narcissist, love is equated with two things. One is attention, and the other is admiration. And you can click that again. There you go. Attention and admiration. And as long as people remain instrumental in giving them admiration and attention, you will be held in high regard. But if you cause that narcissist to doubt their illusion of self-worth, you can become subject to a reign of terror or dismissed like a fly on the wall with no afterthought. So, you know, narcissists are very difficult to treat. We know that. And narcissistic addicts are difficult to treat. But we have to remember, and I really try to remember with challenging people, that the more difficult the defenses, the deeper the trauma. A mentor of mine taught me long ago, the question is not what's wrong with you. The question often is what happened to you. You know, the creator of Dracula was Bram Stoker. And Bram Stoker modeled his character, the vampire, after a banker in London. The legend of the vampire tells the plight of one who's half dead and half alive, who looks into the mirror and sees what? When vampires traditionally and historically look into the mirror, what do they see? Nothing. A vampire must charm and seduce victims in order to feed on them, because without that supply, this creature would cease to exist. As you'll see in the next slide, every narcissist needs a supply. And you can keep clicking on this, Danny. I'll tell you when to stop. There are three sources, primary sources of supply. I call them feeding tanks. The way that narcissist gets that attention and admiration is they plug in to either the mate, the children, or coworkers. I don't know how many of you have worked for a narcissistic addict before, or worked in an agency where there's been a narcissist. It's tough. It's tough. And when that supply decreases, what you'll see in your clients is rage, dysphoria, anxiety. I want to tell you a story about, you know, whenever I'm speaking to live audiences and I talk about, you know, the work environment and sometimes working for a narcissist or somebody who's got those traits. A lot of people identify with this. I want to tell you a story. I worked for an agency where the new director was a narcissistic addict. This is a woman who was so vindictive that, you know, you would walk in the morning and the mood swings would go up and down with her. We had a tiptoe around her. The agency became very isolated. And I thought, okay, this is a new boss. I'm going to invite her home for dinner and maybe I can make friends with her. And at that time, my daughter was about 9 years old. And I warned my daughter that the boss is coming for dinner. And don't be surprised, darling, if she's a little abrupt. You know, she was raised in an orphanage and put herself through school. She's a self-made woman. The next night, she came for dinner and we were all sitting around the table and this woman was obnoxious. She was interrupting people at the table. She was already, she had a few drinks before she got there. She went into her dish and picked out some pimento and put it on my plate, saying, I never liked those vegetables. Or my daughter was just staring at her like this, staring at her. And finally, my boss said, what are you staring at? And my daughter said, my mother said you were a self-made woman. And I thought, thank God. And in the next breath, my daughter looked at her and said, why did you make yourself like that? Why did you make yourself like that? Well, what happened is I didn't get fired, but I only worked there for another 2 weeks because I realized the price we were all paying by working with this woman who was so unaware of what she was doing to this agency. I don't know if any of you relate to this, but companions, children, co-workers. And I believe that this woman, by the way, since got into recovery. So, bless her heart. In the next slide, you'll see that when a narcissist loses a source of supply, it's called a narcissistic injury. And the narcissistic injury is that excruciating anguish. This loss triggers a profound sense of shame and this despair that often has its roots in childhood. And the narcissist spends his or her life expunging their internal pain. So when a narcissist loses a source of supply, that's when you're going to see them in therapy and in treatment. And the next slide will show you that there are 3 responses, 3 reactions to losing a source of supply. Number 1, you'll see that person frantically grope for an alternative source of supply. They'll become enraged, depressed, and childlike, or they'll self-medicate. Let me talk about this for a minute. Frantically grope for another source of supply. What I mentioned in the beginning is you will rarely see a narcissist without a relationship. Rarely. I remember I had a narcissistic client, and often, like borderline clients, this fella could sense when I was about ready to go on vacation for some reason. It's uncanny. And I was going to take a long weekend off, and he happened to call again in crisis and saying, Rokelle, I'm going to use again. He had about 16 months of recovery. I'm going to use again. Jane just left me. I think I'm going to have a nervous breakdown, and this has happened before. So I said to him, John, I'm so sorry, and you've met our psychiatrist here in the office, and I'm going to have him give you a call so he can attend to you. And that's when I hear, Rokelle, aren't I paying you enough so you could stay in town and help me out? I mean, surely. So, the abuse starts. But I practiced boundaries, and I said, again, I'm so sorry. Well, what happened is I did go out of town, and John was hospitalized for 2 nights. Two nights in the hospital, and I got back and I called him. And I said, how are you doing, John? And how is your grief about Jane? And it was almost like Jane who, because in the hospital, he met Tracy. He's on to absolutely the next relationship. Narcissists have to be in a relationship. You can perhaps call them not sex addicts, relationship addicts, but this is part of what they need to mirror. And often, just like when John called me, often there's a time when the counselor isn't available, when the narcissistic patient needs him or her. And this patient will be outraged to learn that you're not an extension of him or her. And that is the beginning of the possibility of emotional connection, believe it or not, even though they're outraged. Before I go any further and talk more about the narcissistic addict, I want to clarify that there are a couple types of narcissists I want to discuss with you. And the next slide will show you that there's variations in narcissistic organization. there's two types of narcissists I want to talk about. One is called the somatic narcissist. And this is a narcissist that uses his or her body, parades his or her possessions, exhibits, the clothes, points out their sexual exploits. This is the narcissist who's often hypochondriacal about little cuts or scrapes on the body. They're exercise freaks. And then we have the cerebral narcissist. A cerebral narcissist is someone who uses their intelligence and verbal acumen to get supply, to get that adoration. They become angry, can become snide and demeaning. Cerebral narcissists often neglect their bodies. They see them as a nuisance. Now, narcissists can be both cerebral and somatic, but usually one is dominant. So somatic narcissists, since somatic narcissists are already preoccupied with their bodies, the place that I usually start is with the body. To be able to go underneath that obsessive behavior by starting a body dialogue, explain that in a minute. John Kabat-Zinn's body scan is excellent for soothing for somatic narcissists. A body scan is about getting still, doing some breathing, and asking that somatic narcissist, so what's your stomach trying to tell you today? What expression would your stomach be making right now if it had an expression on its face? Put yourself in that body position. What does your tight chest want to say? Integrating thought and feeling, which is a developmental task of that rapprochement stage in 18 months to 3. Integrating thought and feeling. You want to get them back into their body and be able to think about what they're feeling. I also want to turn your attention now to cerebral narcissists. Cerebral narcissists probably are the most difficult for me. One of the effects of developmental trauma is loss of connection. Loss of connection to the self, loss of connection to the world, and cerebral narcissists are prime examples of that disconnection. And again, I really have found that somatic processing and experiential therapy is really the way forward to help them to go into their felt sense rather than talking, because the power struggles with these folks are enormous. Because of their verbal acumen, and that's how they glean admiration, I try to say as little as possible, actually, because they can really talk rings around you, and they protect their vulnerability by remaining very cognitive so that nothing much happens. In fact, I want to show you an exercise that I use with particularly cerebral narcissists. Can you change the slide? Thank you. And just click it like 6 times. Thank you. This is an exercise that I've done. And, I really want to encourage all of you to bring forward your creativity. There's not one answer to this. Sometimes we really have to get creative. I asked one woman, a narcissistic addict, to do this drawing. And she could either write words or she could draw a picture. And I asked her, so what do you feel is your greatest accomplishment to date? And if you click on that, she felt that giving up alcohol was her greatest accomplishment to date. The next one, her biggest regret, she still feels that she's imprisoned by her anger and by her grief. I thought that was a brilliant answer. What's missing, she really misses a loving, intimate sexual relationship, she said. She came to treatment because her lover left her. And she was without that source of supply. And of course, she fell in love with somebody else in treatment. That's always an issue. When I asked her what her gift was, what she said, and if you click on that for me, Danny, thanks. What she said is, I am a wonderful mother. Well, I know that's not true. So the choice then is to do a reality check or just let it go. What was profound to me is that the next question, who or what do I need to let go of or forgive? What she wrote is, I need to forgive that girl I was at 18, who ran out of the house, slept with a bunch of different men, got pregnant at 19, and gave that child away. The grief that she has over that is something that she couldn't talk about, but she could write it for me. She could write it for me. This girl grew up with a narcissistic mother, and narcissists beget narcissists. And this girl was criticized, punished. Her mother locked her in the room for being pregnant. Pretty bad, pretty horrible. And that girl still carries the shame. When I asked her, how do you want to be remembered? What she said, I want to be remembered with love. And I thought she was going to say, I wanted to be remembered for being a really good athlete. And actually, she's not a girl. She's a young woman. To me, she's a girl because I'm a senior citizen, but it's a whole other story. Doing these drawings rather than talking has been really, really helpful. And if you want more ideas, there's some really good workbooks that perhaps I'll talk about during the question and answer session. Cerebral narcissist. I just want to tell you a little bit of a story here. Jim was in treatment, and I was his counselor. He's rather heavy set, and he would walk into the room and he would be very articulate, but no internal reference. You know, he couldn't talk about his emotions. This was his third go round of treatment. And, you know, my aim was to guide him toward a more of a felt sense of himself. That under his anger and blame, because he would blame everybody in group, he blamed his wife. Truthfully, he was not connected to his own body, his own grief. So he comes in the office one day, and I ask him, so how does it feel in your body today, James? And I let him feel inside a little bit. And all he did was look at me and sneer. And there was silence in the room. Silence in the room. You know, in graduate school, I wasn't taught how important silence is in a session. Because when I had to just wait, you know, I had to soothe myself, because my anxiety was creeping up. Well, he didn't answer, so I reframed the question and said, you know, how does your body feel? What kind of felt sense do you have today? Are you jumpy? Are you shaky? And we sat again, and all of a sudden he blurted out. He said, Rokelle, it's a heavy feeling in my stomach. And now, even though he said it with anger, now he's in touch with his heaviness, and I can begin to inquire into this. And it's called developing the witness. He's able to comment on his experience. So I asked him to go back into his body, and I said, you know, John, what's so heavy today? What's so heavy? And we waited. He started to get fidgety, and all of a sudden he said, Rokelle, it's anger. It's just sitting in my gut. It's weighing me down, and it's eating me from the inside out. How graphic. Now his face starts to change color. His words start to take on intensity. But even more than anger, he said, I'm disappointed in her. She's not her old self. You know, folks, if I could write a book again about narcissists, I'd I'd write it about blame, and it would be called "I'm okay, you're really sick." Because when he started to say how disappointed he was in her, I thought, great, we're back to the blaming again, back to the beginning. And I had to be mindful not to comment on that, because in the next breath, what he said, and I'm so ashamed, he said, things used to be so good between us, and now we don't listen to each other. Now the we is here, that's great. And we're on the edge of something, I can feel it. And then he said, and as you know, I haven't let her know that I miss her. And that's so heavy because I've locked my love away because I'm too frightened. Look, this wasn't done in the first session. And this is a chronic alcoholic with strong narcissistic traits. But it's about getting to that felt sense, that underlying shame, and to be able to process that with them, the cerebral narcissist. So when we talk about addiction in narcissism, and you can put on the next slide, Danny, thank you. Addiction in narcissism. This is a cartoon. It says, "Hi, my name is Jim, and I don't care who you are." And this is a Narcissist Anonymous meeting, 7 to whatever-ish. I want to talk about addiction and narcissism. And as you change, you'll see in this next slide, there are 2 circumstances that motivate a narcissist to go to treatment. One of them I mentioned is the threat of the loss of a primary supply, a mate, coworker, or they've met with some failure so that their strategies no longer work. And when that happens, if you click it once more, Danny, they fall into what's called the grandiosity gap. The grandiosity gap between their grandiose, unlimited self-image and their actual limited and shameful reality. And what you'll see in the next slide is a little bit of an explanation. Grandiosity gap is where the narcissist really falls off the pedestal. It's, they feel like they're going into the abyss, but this is where we can finally connect with them, because this is when they'll show their vulnerability, their fear, and their anxiety. So when we talk about narcissism and addiction, on the next slide, you'll see this. You know the tale of Alice in Wonderland? Alice Adventures in Wonderland tells about a young woman who swallows a magic pill and drops down into the rabbit hole, into a strange and wondrous land. If you link that tale of Alice in Wonderland to the myth of Narcissus, who's captivated by his own image, you have a description of the narcissistic addict. The man or woman who is both narcissistically disordered and completely lost in a version of Wonderland. And you'll see this quote under the title. It's by a wonderful therapist in London named Phil Jocelyn, who says, "So powerful is the draw to the silvery pool of the drug that no longer do I need food, shelter, or warmth, and slowly, day by day, I pine and wither away and die." You know, working with the narcissistic addict, when the addict is treated, you as a therapist or clinician will be threatened to withhold anything that disturbs that mirror. Yet it's precisely what's required for the narcissistic addict to have any kind of recovery. We do need to cause ripples in that mirror, and sometimes that can feel very threatening. So we have to practice self-soothing techniques of our own, and also some good supervision. In treatment, you can change the slide, thanks. In treatment, the narcissist is a master of disguise. And folks, I hope it makes sense to you why so many narcissists would turn to alcohol and drugs to heal that chasm between the false self and the shame. In treatment, expect narcissists to be above the rules, rationalize their addiction to support their grandiose self. Oh, I need to smoke marijuana because I can't paint without it. Really cocaine helps me with my inspiration. They rationalize their addiction. They will learn the vernacular of treatment and recovery, and they'll do a performance and not get one thing out of the experience. They can control the sessions. They can derail with distractions or charms, and we need to keep setting very clear boundaries. Just like the parent in the grocery store, we need to be firm as well as respectful, firm and respectful boundaries. And the next slide shows you the narcissist anticipates abandonment. They just assume it's going to happen. So rather than wait for you to abandon them, if anybody's going to do the leaving around here, I am. And as you'll see underneath that slide, that's why you'll see insulting behavior, bullying, humiliating. They are provoking you to go away because they know it's going to happen anyway. This is part of the trauma. So on the next slide, you'll see just a reminder to all of us. And this has been stunning to me through the years. And a narcissist isn't in treatment or therapy because they think they have a problem. They seek therapy or treatment because they want you to restore their grandiosity. And therapists and clinicians can easily fall into that trap. Easily. Because these are folks that are very challenging. So rather than cause ripples in the mirror, I have found myself too trying to, soothe them and restore the grandiosity, and that's exactly contradictory to really what they need. I would not treat a narcissist, or put it this way. In the next slide, you'll see it takes a village, meaning that I work with a narcissist individually only long enough to get them into a group because they need the eyes and ears of other people, hopefully with a co-facilitator. I think all addicts need a multifaceted, multidisciplinary approach, but particularly narcissists. They need to balance physical activity, especially the somatic and the cerebral. Somatic needs to balance their exercise activity, and cerebral narcissists need to be able to move their body. Different forms of mindfulness and meditation, and I'll go through a couple that have been helpful in my treatment of narcissistic addicts. Community service, absolutely, and a 12-step program. The Center for Substance Abuse really recommends a 12-step program for narcissistic addicts, actually. If someone leaves treatment who has these narcissistic traits and can, by the grace of God, find some kind of sponsor who's also recovering from addiction and narcissistic traits, it can be very helpful. The problem is that what I've seen in my own community is that if you live in a larger city, narcissists will go in one meeting and they'll two-step. All of a sudden, they'll become the gurus in a short time. And if they don't get the admiration they want, they'll just find another meeting across town. So that's a danger that we have to watch for. Also, medication if needed. Medication with needed, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. Now, I don't know if any of you have found this, but when you're treating a spouse of a narcissist, I don't know if any of you have had difficulty getting that narcissistic family member or narcissistic spouse to come into treatment for a family program. was working with a spouse of a narcissist, and this was an individual treatment. She was pretty beaten down, emotionally battered. And what happened is, you know, because she was working on boundaries, I really wanted her to practice forming boundaries with her narcissistic spouse. And he wouldn't come in. He would not come into treatment, and not treatment, into therapy. Since I felt it was important for him to come, I worked on what's called the paradoxical letter. And again, this is bringing forward your creativity. I wrote him a letter. I call it a paradoxical letter, and I certainly can send it to anybody who would like it. I want to read this to you. It says this: Dear Joe, I'm very impressed with your deep commitment to your marriage and your assurance that everything is as it should be. And that's what he kept saying when I wanted him to come in and work with his wife. He said, now everything is as it should be. The letter continues. I say, you are to be commended on your willingness to sacrifice some of your own needs and your willingness to have your wife work ardently on her development and independence. I also appreciate that you're able to encourage Joyce to present her issues in dealing with your marriage, trusting the accuracy of her perceptions about you and the marriage without feeling the need to come in and discuss your side. Since Joyce has informed me that you're paying for counseling jointly, I thought you would like to know that she's making good progress and clarifying what she wants in the marriage. Joyce has told me you don't wish to join our sessions, and I respect your stand and the firmness in which you and the firmness with which you adhere to it. Your continued sacrifice in not coming in has been very helpful. Of course, whenever you feel she has made sufficient individual progress, you're welcome to join us. Well, let me tell you what happened. I got a call after you received the letter. What is this about, Rokelle? And what are you doing with her? The long and the short is, I kept calling, and he came in the next week with her. The paradoxical letter. I think that because even though he begrudgingly came in, she was able to practice in real time her boundaries with him and share some of her grief with him, even though he couldn't even hear it. So again, it's bringing forward your creativity. Some people agree with that. Is it manipulative? Absolutely, it's manipulative, but it happened to work. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the narcissistic relationship. And since Joyce and Joe are still together, I want to speak about narcissistic relationships because these painful relationships in recovery is such a trigger for relapse. So you can, if you'd put on the next slide for me. Narcissist, the dumping ground for shame and a profound trigger for relapse. So true. Yeah, because as I mentioned in the beginning, these narcissistic characteristics don't go away in treatment. They're exacerbated. So the next slide will show you a little bit of a cartoon called the Narcissistic Dating Experience. And you can click on it again. And here's the picture. And the caption is, enough talk about me, let's turn the conversation to you. And the bottom says, what do you like about me? Narcissists need mirroring, the narcissistic relationship. And I'm going to, I might have to see if I can, the narcissistic relationship. This was written by a recovering addict who spent about 3 good years confronting his narcissistic traits. He wrote the 12 steps of relationship for narcissists. And Danny, I'm going to have you click on this 12 times. The first step is, just one at a time. Oh, there you go. First one. There you go. First one. Okay. Number one. Nope, that's okay. Just stay there. I decided my life would be wonderful if my spouse would change. I firmly believe there's no greater power than myself, and anyone who says so is insane. Click again. In my relationship, I made a decision to remove my wolf from God, who doesn't understand the situation. I made a searching and thorough inventory of my partner, so he or she can't fool me or take advantage of me. Fifth step, I tried to get my spouse to admit to me the exact nature of his wrongs. I became willing to help her get rid of her defects of character. I was humbled enough to ask him to remove his shortcomings for his own best interest. Step 8, I made a list of all the ways my spouse has harmed me and always wait patiently for a chance to get even. Step 9, I get even whenever possible, except when to do so would get me in trouble. Step 10, continuing to take her inventory, I promptly make my partner admit her wrongdoing on a regular basis. Sought through manipulation and control to get my partner to see that my ideas are best and she ought to surrender to my will. And finally, the 12th step, having maintained my emotional problems for years with these steps, I can thoroughly recommend them to others who wish to practice neurosis and loneliness in their relationships the rest of their days. The 12 steps of narcissistic relationships. So if you'll notice, and if you haven't guessed already, I believe it takes a grown-up sense of humor. And I use humor very intentionally. And even though in Minnesota, the land of 12 steps, they would see this as blasphemous, I think it takes a very grown-up sense of humor sometimes to allow people to be a little less narcissistically involved with their issues. So, I'm going to have you click the next slide, please. Who does a narcissist choose as a mate? Fellow narcissist, or one that feels inadequate, sometimes a child of an alcoholic, someone who is willing to sacrifice his or her needs and endure confinement. There is no way that a spouse of a narcissist can claim their own space. The house, wherever you live, is in full ownership of that narcissist. There is a press for symbiotic unity that demands that a mate hold identical perceptions of the world. You are to see the world that I see it. You have to feel the way I feel. And then, if you click on it, the mate is detested for it because narcissists hate witnessing self-sacrifice. So this is a catch-22. You just can't win. And it causes a lot of pain. And the next slide, what I'd like to show you is a diagram of a narcissistic relationship. I've seen this too many times that I feel like it's worth showing to you. So if you stop right there, Danny, it begins with shame. It's two people who have issues of shame to deal with. And this shame often leads to what's called a narcissistic vulnerability. And both people in that relationship are very, very thin-skinned, constantly taking offense. And this leads to narcissistic expectations, that one should be completely devoted to the meeting of my needs. And these expectations fall in two categories. Usually one person in the relationship, this narcissistic relationship, craves admiration. The other person in the relationship craves attention. So you can find somebody who will prop you up in that pedestal. I'll prop you up in that pedestal, but in return, you better pay close attention to me. You better close. So this leads to, if you click the next one, hypersensitivity. Each one becomes hypersensitive to any nuance of criticism or neglect. Your tie is crooked can lead to World War III. You didn't kiss me like you meant it. And if you click on it again, Danny. So you're not going to pay attention to me? I'm going to bring you down. I'm going to bring you down by criticism. Oh, really? You're going to bring me down by criticism? Then I'm going to neglect you. I won't pay attention to you. And just click again if you would. This is that narcissistic wounding that brings up all the shame. You can and click once more if you do. In this relationship, when the narcissistic wounding occurs, one person turns to rage, the other person turns to anxiety, and if you click again, and they lock right there. This is called a bonding pattern. That they can't even talk about the weather anymore, with one turning to rage, one turning to anxiety. Then we have, with the next click, it's called projective identification. They'll take each other's symptoms and try to project it on the other. And this leads to more conflict and relapse than you can imagine. It's the kind of fights that make dinosaur battles look small. So I want to tell you, I'll give you an example of this. I'll give you an example of this. And I want to show you a story about Sue and Max, if you want to change the slide. Sue is a recovering alcoholic with narcissistic traits. And Max is a child of an alcoholic with narcissistic wounds. And as you see, Cupid up there says, this won't be boring. The next slide shows Sue. Act 1, the bonding pattern begins. And in the next slide, it shows Sue. So let me show you what happens. Max is a vice president of a large corporation here in the Twin Cities. And, or he was a vice president. They have since moved away. And he was to receive an award. He invited Sue to the dinner, and Sue said, was a little bit nervous about it. She said, well, please call me at 5:30. Let me know what the other, if it's formal, informal, simple question. Well, Max got delayed, and he didn't call her at 5:30. He called her at, I think, 5:45. And you can click it again, Danny. And once more. The fact that he didn't call at 5:30 triggered her anger. He's leaving me, and her shame. And what she did, one more, she canceled the date. She canceled the date. And then you'll see in the next slide, Max. So Max, and his narcissistic traits, longs for admiration. And he was raised by a narcissistic addict who demanded admiration. And if you click that slide again, we have a lot of animation here. If she really loved me, she wouldn't do this. And he is enraged and detests her for making him feel so insecure. Act 2. The plot sickens. So you'll see in this next slide, Max threatens abandonment. He gets absolutely irate. I can't stand this, I'm leaving. And in the next breath, you'll see Sue down there, almost down on her hands and knees. Please don't leave me. I'll do anything. So they reverse. This is where the projective identification happens. In the next slide, they go to therapy. Then the blame starts. Maybe you can help him, Rokelle, with his anger problem. Who's angry? Sue's angry. And Max says, I've never met anybody who's so insecure. He's insecure. This is what I mean by projective identification. It is crazy making. This relationship caused Sue to relapse twice. She's out of this relationship now, but if you click the next slide, the conclusion, you can press it, is the therapist is no longer seeing couples. That's not true, but it's just absolutely crazy making what happens in these narcissistic relationships. Absolutely. When I talk about the bonding pattern, and if you have a family program, and you have that kind of narcissistic dynamic go on. The idea is we need to undo that bonding pattern, that lock between the rage and anxiety. And the next slide will talk about that bonding pattern. Dissolving the bonding pattern, which is, click it again, Danny. Yeah. If the two of them, if Sue would have been able to track her vulnerability and say to Max, you know, I get so scared when you don't call on time. If Max could have said to Sue, I get so hurt when you threaten to cancel. It's that kind of vulnerability that really dissolves the bonding pattern. Narcissists and narcissistic addicts need to learn how to disengage respectfully. Instead of getting irate, to be able to say, you know, I'm so upset right now, I can't talk, I'll call you back. Mindful strategies for self-soothing and compassion that are non-destructive. When I say self-soothing, I don't mean eating a gallon of ice cream. Practicing ways to soothe oneself that are productive, dissolving the bonding pattern. And for spouses of narcissists that are imprisoned, I've done this in treatment, and you can change the slide if you will, Danny. Can you, well, the slide, there we go. It's so slow.
Rokelle, we're gonna do about 5 more minutes, and then we want to open it up for some questions as well. We just want to keep in line that we have the Q&A coming up at some point as well.
Oh, okay. So probably I should skip ahead. Well, go ahead with this slide, if you will.
Okay. Let me get over there.
And I'm not going to go through this, but
Okay. 5 more.
5 more minutes.
Yeah. Is that cool? And then we can wrap up for questions.
Okay. So this is a Bill of Rights. I have spouses of narcissists create their own Bill of Rights, that I have a right to be respected with courtesy and respect. And I want to skip to, can I skip to the second to the last slide, Danny? Okay. Yeah, I think, go ahead with the
Keep going? Okay.
Go ahead with that. Just click on it. All right. What I want to say is that clinicians, we need to be aware of our own shame and our own countertransference, because according to Lisa Najovitz, addiction and access to diagnoses create the most countertransference in clinicians. And when you find yourself getting triggered, there are ways that I have taught clinicians to take a break and silence. Do I have time for the next slide or not? Go ahead, put on the next slide. Non-defensive responses. These are simple things that I've memorized like clockwork. Why is it won't get, there you go. So I'm going to just leave you with that when you start to get triggered as a clinician, shaking your head, breathing, maybe so, could be, that's very interesting. These are very simple. And if you can memorize these, it gives you a couple minutes to calm down and respond with the intellect and grace of a good clinician, and not coming from your history. So I guess, folks, I'm asked to stop here. Is that right?
Okay, she has 5 more.
Do I have 5 more?
Obviously, you see the magic behind the scenes. No, we're going to Liz. I'm going to bring you on. Do you want to go ahead and wrap up for questions?
Yeah, pretty soon, Rokelle. I think you've got a few more minutes, and then we'll do questions, and then we're going to go into the panel discussion at 2:00 Mountain Time. So we want to be wrapped up here probably in the next 10 minutes. So you've got a little bit of time with Q&A.
Okay. So
I maybe talk a little bit more about transference. I think that's a huge issue with clinicians.
Well, let me talk a little bit more. Let me give you an example of some transference. There was a fellow that I worked with. We'll call him Don. And Don was in a gay relationship, very closeted. And he lost his primary source of supply. He kept cheating on his lover, felt entitled to do so. And his lover finally left. Well, Don used to cruise the bars at night. And when I first was introduced to him, he sat down. I started speaking to him. He presented himself as rather quiet and shy. And I happened to look up on the bookcase at the clock to make sure we had enough time. And all of a sudden, Don said to me, Rokelle, am I boring you? I said, no, Don, not at all. Why? He said, well, you're looking away. And, this is quote, I went down a list of therapists to see, and honestly, you were 4 on the list. You were not my top choice. So if what I'm saying doesn't intrigue you that much, well, needless to say, he was so acutely aware of my shifts in inattention. It was my first clue. This guy may have narcissistic traits or be a narcissist. So he came in gradually through time. And one day he came in, he had been cruising downtown the bars again. And I commented on his self-hatred he must have felt. And he had unprotected sex. And sometimes with narcissists, you have to articulate the vulnerability for them. So I told him, so for a brief period of time, you must have forgotten that you felt so freakish, that somebody handsome could be that attracted to you. And he agreed. He said, yep, for that time I felt really important. Well, let me get to the countertransference. What happened is I became the best therapist in town, absolutely the best. He was going to take me to his business. He was going to advocate. And one day he called me because he wanted to have a luncheon for me out of his gratefulness and invite a lot of his friends. And I said to him, Don, I don't do that. And that's for your protection. Well, he practically hung up on me. And then I knew what was going to happen. I've been overvalued. He came in the office and he started staring at my hands. And I had a lot of polish chipped off and, finally I got so distracted by that. And I said, Don, what are you staring at? And he literally said to me, Rokelle, how can you walk around that way? I would be embarrassed to be seen in public with you, with your nails like that. Well, this is mother's voice. This is mother's voice. And I was flipped back. I got speechless. I got shamed. I got anxious. I was sitting on my hands. When the session was over, by the way, it was lunchtime. Guess where I went? Yeah, to the manicurist and called my supervisor. The next time Dan came in, basically he longed to be my special patient, and I knew that. And when I wouldn't agree, I was devalued. The next time he came in, I said, I asked him, would you please not comment on my appearance, which was that stupid thing to say. What if I had my wits about me? What I would have said to him is, Don, why is that so important to you? Why are my nails so important to you? What does that mean to you that you have to comment on that? If I would have taken a breath, soothed myself, those are the questions that I would have asked. And I think it's so rampant, this transference. I think, I don't know how much time I have. So I guess what I'll do is end here. And I'm going to end with a poem. Is that okay?
That's great.
All right. And this is a poem I've used with many recovering addicts, those with narcissistic wounds. And it's a poem by, oh God, I'm having a senior moment. I'll remember in a minute. It goes like this. It's called Love After Love. And it goes that the day will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror. And each will smile at the other's greeting, saying, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give flowers, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who's loved you all your life, who you've ignored for others, who knows you by heart. Take down all the desperate notes, all the false images. Peel your true image from that mirror. Sit and feast on your life. And that's David Walcott. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, Rokelle, thank you so much. That was an excellent, excellent presentation. I wish we'd had more time to get more from you. You've just got so much knowledge on this, and it's a fascinating topic. I really have not known that much about narcissism. We do have some questions, but in less than a half an hour, we have our panel discussion. So we are going to ask those questions during that time. For the questions that came through, I just want to let you know that we will be answering in the panel, and we will also respond on Facebook. But stay tuned, because in less than 30 minutes, our panel will start. So Rokelle, you can take a breather, and we're going to reconvene with the speakers at 1:45 to prepare for the audience at 2 o'clock. Rokelle, thank you from the bottom of my heart. You are a true gem, and we're so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Danny.
Yeah.
And John, too. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Danny.